When we imagine a medieval city, we see fairs, majestic cathedrals, knights, and bustling streets full of merchants. We are used to thinking of medieval cities as fairy tale places. In our imagination, majestic cathedrals, noisy fairs, and valiant knights come to life, and the very air seems to be filled with the spirit of adventure. But let's forget about romantic stories for a moment and look behind the grand facade. Where the stone walls end, another world begins, a world of constant struggle for survival. This is a place where the streets were a source of disease, where every second person could be a criminal, and where the only law was force. The urban slums, filled with disease and poverty, were a real cauldron where survival was harder than on the battlefield. In this video, we will reveal the truth about what was hidden in the shadows and show why the medieval city was not a place of beauty, but a real hell. Watch the video to the end to find out how the city's architecture helped fight crime. The medieval city was a labyrinth of narrow, winding streets. Sometimes the width of a passageway was no more than 2 meters. The houses were so close together that their roofs almost touched, casting a permanent shadow over the streets. On rare sunny days, light only briefly penetrated this stone corridor. The lack of direct sunlight, poor ventilation, and constant humidity created ideal conditions for the spread of dirt and unpleasant odors. People lived in constant shadow, which affected not only their physical condition, but also their outlook on life. In contrast to the wide avenues and squares associated with power and order, these narrow streets were areas of chaos. Criminals and vagrants hid there, and the law of the jungle prevailed. The architecture of the medieval city reflected not only economic opportunities, but also social realities. Houses were built haphazardly, without a unified plan, which led to dense, disorderly development. Each landowner sought to squeeze the most out of their land, so houses were often built upwards and expanded towards the street, creating so-called hanging or overhanging floors. This further exacerbated the problem of lack of light and air, turning the lower levels of the city into gloomy and damp spaces. The narrow alleys that seem picturesque to us today were dark and dangerous at the time, where it was easy to get lost or fall victim to robbers. These streets, which had no pavements, were constantly covered with dirt, waste, and sewage. The lack of sanitary standards and a basic sewage system meant that all waste was dumped directly onto the streets, often from the windows of the upper floors. Residents walking down the street risked being splashed with slop. This not only created disgusting odors, but also an ideal environment for the spread of disease. Overcrowding and poor hygiene turned every sneeze into a potential epidemic. In such dense and chaotic conditions, there was a constant feeling of claustrophobia and discomfort. People lived side by side but did not feel safe. The lack of open spaces, except for market squares and cathedral courtyards, made the city resemble a beehive. People, like bees, were forced to exist in a confined space, which created social tension. In addition, this type of construction contributed to the spread of fires. Houses built of wood stood so close together that fires spread instantly from one building to another, reducing entire neighborhoods to ashes. The lack of wide streets that could serve as fire breaks made fighting fires virtually impossible. This proves once again how fragile and dangerous life was in a medieval city. Criminals felt right at home in these labyrinths of shadows and winding alleys. The narrow passages allowed them to easily escape pursuit. A lone person in such an alley was an easy target. It was difficult for the authorities to maintain order in these confusing neighborhoods, and the law of the street prevailed. How do you think you would feel if you found yourself on such a street? How different is it from life in a modern city? Write your thoughts in the comments. Medieval cities were hotbeds of unsanitary conditions, which became one of the main causes of mass disease. The lack of a centralized water supply and sewage system was not just an inconvenience, but a constant threat to life. The water that people drew from wells was often located near cesspools and waste disposal sites, which led to its contamination. This dirty water was used for drinking, cooking, and washing, becoming the main source of cholera, typhoid fever, and dysentery. Urban waste, including household garbage and human excrement, was dumped directly onto the streets. In some cities, there were special night pots, the contents of which were poured out of windows directly onto the roadway. This created not only an unbearable smell, but also a constant source of infection. Dirt and waste accumulated in narrow streets, forming foul-smelling ditches that became breeding grounds for disease. The lack of basic hygiene was the norm, which contributed to the rapid spread of infections. Life in such conditions was a real ordeal. People lived in a constant struggle with diseases that are easily treatable today. Even a common cold or a minor wound could have serious consequences. Antibiotics and modern medicines were unavailable, and knowledge about the causes of diseases was extremely limited. Many diseases were considered punishment for sins, and people relied solely on prayer and God's mercy. Doctors who practiced at the time often used ineffective methods, such as bloodletting, which could only worsen the patient's condition. The most terrible disasters were epidemics. The Black Death, which swept across Europe in the 14th century, claimed the lives of millions of people and devastated entire cities. Its spread was facilitated by overcrowding and complete unsanitary conditions. Rats which swarmed in cities carried fleas infected with the plague. People lived in constant fear of a new epidemic, and this fear permeated their entire lives. Cities which were supposed to be centers of civilization turned into death traps. In addition, there were no special places for burying the dead in cities. Cemeteries were located in the city center, next to churches, which also contributed to the spread of infections. Overcrowded cemeteries and the lack of sanitary standards made them dangerous to health. It was a vicious circle. Unsanitary conditions bred disease, and disease exacerbated unsanitary conditions. The city authorities, of course, tried to combat this problem, but their efforts were insufficient. They issued decrees prohibiting the dumping of waste on the streets, but the lack of control and punishment made these measures ineffective. The only option for wealthy citizens was to build houses outside the city, where they could live in cleaner conditions. But for most people, this was an unaffordable luxury. How much do you think unsanitary conditions affected life expectancy in the Middle Ages? What else affected life expectancy? Watch the video to the end to find out the answer to this question. Medieval cities did not have the justice system we know today. Police, courts, and prisons existed, but their effectiveness left much to be desired. Crime was widespread, and no one felt safe. Robberies and muggings were commonplace. Laws often did not work, and people took matters into their own hands. This led to even more chaos. Formally, there were judicial bodies in medieval cities, but their accessibility and fairness were highly questionable. The justice system was complex and often depended on a person's social status. Rich and influential townspeople could easily avoid punishment, while the poor faced harsh penalties even for minor offenses. This inequality undermined faith in the law and fostered a sense of impunity among those in power. In addition, the city guards, who served as police, were few in number and poorly organized. Their main task was to maintain order during the day, and at night the city was virtually unguarded. Night was a time of robbery, and people generally did not venture out after dark. Narrow, dark alleys became ideal places for ambushes and robberies. The most common crimes were theft and robbery. In conditions of poverty and hunger, people often resorted to desperate measures to feed themselves and their families. Stealing bread or a chicken could result in the death penalty, while a wealthy merchant who cheated his customers went unpunished. This injustice led to an even greater increase in crime. Unable to obtain protection from the authorities, people were forced to take justice into their own hands. Vendettas and blood feuds were commonplace. If a person did not have the money to hire a lawyer or pay a bribe, they could only resolve the issue by force. This led to constant conflicts between families and clans. Prisons in the Middle Ages were not places of rehabilitation. They were dirty and overcrowded, where people were kept in inhumane conditions. Prison guards often treated prisoners like animals, and many of them died of disease. Prison was not a punishment, but rather a temporary place of detention until the criminal was executed or able to pay a fine. Another factor contributing to the rise in crime was the lack of work. Many people who came to the city in search of a better life could not find steady employment. They lived on the streets, begged, and simply had no means of subsistence. This pushed them into a life of crime. Under such conditions, cities turned into real social jungles where only the strongest survived. The law was powerless, and people lived in constant fear. It was a society where everyone was on their own and where there was no place for compassion or mercy. The only way to survive was to adapt to these cruel rules and learn to defend oneself. In addition to obvious dangers such as robbery and banditry, city dwellers faced threats from organized criminal gangs. These gangs, often made up of former soldiers and deserters, controlled entire neighborhoods. They engaged in racketeering, extorting money from shopkeepers and craftsmen in exchange for protection from other criminals. If anyone refused to pay, they faced severe consequences, including having their shop burned down or being beaten up. The authorities often turned a blind eye to the activities of such gangs, as their leaders were often connected to influential people or were themselves powerful enough to resist the guards. All this created an atmosphere of mistrust and fear. People could not rely on their neighbors, as anyone could turn out to be a traitor or an informer. Merchants colluded to cheat buyers. Craftsmen formed secret guilds to control the market and suppress competitors. No one could achieve success without the support of the powerful, which further emphasized class divisions and injustice. Meanwhile, the church tried to combat the moral decay of society, but its influence was often limited to words. Priests preached repentance and mercy, but in practice, their calls rarely found an echo. Most townspeople were too busy surviving to think about higher matters. Religion became less a source of moral guidance and more a tool for control and manipulation. Excommunication and public repentance were used as forms of punishment, but for those already living below the poverty line, they meant little. In this chaotic world, law and order were not the norm, but rather the exception. Justice was not served, it was bought or seized by force. People lived in constant tension, not knowing what tomorrow would bring. It was a world where it was not the smartest or the most virtuous who survived, but the most cunning, ruthless, and cruel. The city authorities tried to fight crime, but their efforts were insufficient. They issued decrees, imposed bans, and imposed penalties, but they did not have sufficient resources or powers to enforce them. This created a vicious circle. The more crimes there were, the more decrees there were, and the less faith there was in the law. One of the main reasons for the authorities' powerlessness was the lack of a centralized and professional law enforcement system. The city guards, who were supposed to maintain order, were often not professionals, but ordinary citizens who took turns performing this service. They had neither the proper training nor the necessary weapons or adequate pay. Their main task was to patrol the streets and catch petty thieves, while more serious criminals went unpunished. In addition, the guards were often corrupt and willing to turn a blind eye to crimes in exchange for a small fee. Another factor that hindered the authorities was the lack of clear and uniform legislation. Laws in medieval cities varied and often depended on local customs and traditions. This created legal chaos and allowed criminals to find loopholes. In addition, the judicial system was complex and confusing, and ordinary people could not obtain justice. Court proceedings were long, expensive, and often depended on the whims of judges who could be bribed or act in the interests of the rich and powerful. Furthermore, city authorities were often part of the problem themselves. Many of them were corrupt and used their position for personal gain. They could protect criminals, charge them for protection, or help them avoid punishment. This undermined the authority of the authorities and created a sense of hopelessness among the townspeople. They understood that they could not trust those who were supposed to protect them. The influence of the church also played an important role. The church had its own courts and laws, which often contradicted those of the city. This created even greater chaos and allowed criminals to escape justice if they found refuge in the church. Thus, the city authorities were forced to operate in conditions where their powers were limited and challenged by other forces. The powerlessness of the authorities was particularly noticeable in the slums, where they had virtually no control. These areas were real gray zones where street gangs ruled and their own laws prevailed. The authorities had neither the desire nor the ability to restore order in these areas and were forced to put up with what was happening. All this created a vicious circle. The inefficiency of the authorities led to an increase in crime, and the increase in crime, in turn, further undermined the authority of the authorities. People lost faith in the law and were forced to take their fate into their own hands. Why do you think the authorities were unable to restore order in the city? What, or rather who, could have prevented them from doing so? We will discuss this very soon. Poverty was another serious problem in medieval cities. It did not just exist, but permeated all levels of society except the highest. Many people lived from hand to mouth and had no steady source of income. They worked for pennies or begged to survive. Hunger was a constant companion, forcing people to resort to extreme measures. In conditions where food was worth its weight in gold, people were ready for anything. Medieval cities grew rapidly, but the economy did not always keep pace with this growth. Peasants from the villages flocked to the cities in search of a better life, hoping to find work and escape serfdom. However, the labor market was limited, and many of them remained unemployed. They swelled the ranks of the homeless and destitute who lived in slums on the outskirts of the city. These areas were veritable ghettos, where hopeless poverty and despair reigned. The main source of income for most townspeople was physical labor. They worked in construction, workshops, and markets. However, working conditions were harsh and pay was low. The working day lasted from dawn to dusk, and people worked 6 to 7 days a week. Even with such a regime, they could not earn enough to support themselves and their families. Hunger was a constant companion, forcing people to resort to desperate measures. Another problem was the instability of food prices. In years of poor harvests, the prices of bread and grains skyrocketed, and the poor could not afford to buy even the most basic necessities. This led to hunger riots, which often ended in mass unrest. The city authorities tried to combat this problem, but their measures were insufficient. They set maximum prices for food, but this led to merchants hiding their supplies and selling them on the black market at higher prices. People who were unable to earn an honest living were forced to beg. This was not just a means of survival, but a profession in its own right. Beggars formed groups and divided territories among themselves so as not to compete with each other. They used various tricks and ruses to elicit compassion from passers-by. However, this profession was dangerous, as beggars were often arrested and punished. In addition, hunger and poverty led to an increase in crime. People who could not find work turned to theft and robbery. They robbed the rich in order to feed themselves and their families. This created a vicious circle. Poverty bred crime, and crime, in turn, further exacerbated poverty. All this created an atmosphere of hopelessness in medieval cities. People lived in constant fear of hunger and disease. They had no social security and could lose everything in an instant. It was a society where everyone was out for themselves and there was no room for compassion or mercy. The only way to survive was to adapt to these cruel rules. In addition, hunger and poverty led to another terrible problem: child labor. Many families, unable to feed themselves, gave their children away as apprentices or servants. Children worked alongside adults, and sometimes even harder. Their working conditions were terrible. They were beaten, malnourished, and lived in unsanitary conditions. Child labor was widespread, and no one considered it terrible. Parents saw it as the only way out, because otherwise their children could die of starvation. Another consequence of poverty was epidemics. The slums where the poor lived were breeding grounds for disease. The lack of sewage systems, dirty water, and overcrowding contributed to the rapid spread of infections. Plague, smallpox, and typhus claimed the lives of thousands of people, especially children and the elderly. The authorities tried to combat the epidemics, but their measures were ineffective. They simply isolated entire neighborhoods, leaving people to die without help or medicine. It was cruel, but it was the only solution they could offer. Finally, poverty and hunger led to social instability. The huge number of destitute and starving people, deprived of any hope, created a constant threat of riots and uprisings. When people reached the point of desperation, they were ready to do anything to change their fate. They attacked grain warehouses, looted shops, and demanded justice from the authorities. These riots were brutally suppressed, but they were a reminder that a society built on injustice cannot be stable. In this world, where every day was a struggle for survival, human life was devalued. People lived in constant fear and despair, and their only goal was to live to see the next day. Poverty and hunger were not just problems, but an integral part of everyday life in a medieval city. Medieval society was deeply divided, and this inequality was visible to the naked eye. At the top of the social pyramid were wealthy merchants, aristocrats, and clergy. They lived in luxurious stone houses with high walls and inner courtyards, knew no want, and could afford any pleasure. Their lives were full of comfort and security. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the pyramid were the poor, who lived in slums and struggled to survive each day. This social stratification was evident not only in the standard of living, but also in the city's architecture, which served as a direct reflection of social status. Expensive neighborhoods were clean, with wide streets and well-kept gardens, while poor neighborhoods were dirty and dilapidated. The wealthy neighborhoods had paved streets, which at least partially protected them from dirt and foul odors. The houses belonging to the nobility and merchants were built of stone or brick, making them more durable and secure. The windows were glazed and the interior rooms were spacious and bright. Servants worked in these areas to maintain cleanliness and order. There was little crime here, as wealthy people hired their own guards to protect their property and lives. Life in luxury was filled with refined entertainment and a lifestyle that was inaccessible to ordinary townspeople. Wealthy families held lavish feasts and balls where exotic dishes and expensive wines were served. Women wore luxurious dresses made of silk and velvet adorned with jewels, while men wore clothes made of fine cloth and fur. They sent their children to the best schools and universities, ensuring them a bright future. It was a completely different reality, where the rules of life were determined by money and connections, not hard work and luck. At the same time, the poor neighborhoods were the complete opposite. Here the streets were unpaved and constantly covered in mud. The houses, if you could call them that, were built of wood and clay and were often in disrepair. These dwellings were small, dark, and damp. They had no windows and light only came in through the doorway. Families lived in a single room, which made for cramped conditions and contributed to the spread of disease. There was no running water or sewage system in these areas, and people were forced to use wells which were often contaminated. This social stratification led to constant conflict and tension. The poor, seeing the wealth and luxury that were unavailable to them, felt resentment and injustice. This gave rise to envy and anger, which often erupted into riots and uprisings. The authorities tried to suppress these protests, but they could not eliminate their root cause: poverty and inequality. In addition, social stratification affected access to education and healthcare. Rich people could hire private tutors and doctors, while the poor did not have this opportunity. Their children remained illiterate, and they themselves died from diseases that could have been cured. This inequality was passed down from generation to generation, creating a vicious cycle of poverty that was impossible to break. Social stratification also affected crime. While rich people could buy their way out of punishment, poor people could be sentenced to death for the slightest offense. This created a sense of impunity among some and hopelessness among others. People who had nothing were willing to risk everything to survive. How much did social inequality affect life in a medieval city? Or was it more influenced by the lack of medicine? Stay tuned, we'll discuss this soon. The lack of medical care was another serious problem in medieval cities. Doctors were rare, and their knowledge was limited. Many diseases were considered God's punishment, and people could only hope for a miracle. This, of course, did not contribute to improving the health of the population. Medieval medicine was based on theories that seem absurd to us today. Treatment was based on the so-called theory of four fluids, humors. It was believed that human health depended on the balance of four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Any disease was seen as a disturbance of this balance. Doctors tried to restore it with bloodletting, emetics, and laxatives. These methods often did not help and sometimes even worsened the patient's condition. In addition, there was no understanding of the causes of infectious diseases. People were unaware of the existence of bacteria and viruses, and therefore did not observe basic hygiene. The sick and healthy lived side by side, which contributed to the rapid spread of infections. Wounds and cuts often became infected, and even a small scratch could lead to infection and subsequent loss of a limb. Operations were performed without anesthesia, and surgeons used unsterile instruments, making surgical procedures extremely dangerous. There were few qualified doctors, and they usually served only the rich and influential. Most of the population sought help from healers, herbalists, and barbers. Healers used herbs, spells, and primitive rituals that often had no therapeutic effect. Barbers, who also performed the functions of surgeons, could perform simple operations such as tooth extraction or bloodletting, but their knowledge was superficial and they could cause even greater harm to the patient. Another problem was the lack of hospitals in the modern sense of the word. There were so-called hospital houses, but they were more like shelters for the poor, where the sick received minimal care. There were no qualified doctors, and people usually died from diseases that could have been cured in modern conditions. The lack of hospitals and medical care was one of the main reasons for the high mortality rate in medieval cities. Religious beliefs also played an important role in attitudes toward disease. Many believed that illness was God's punishment for sins. People turned to saints and prayed for miraculous healing instead of seeking medical help. This belief in the supernatural further exacerbated the situation. The lack of basic medicine and unsanitary conditions made life in a medieval city like a lottery, where anyone could fall victim to disease. People lived in constant fear and had no guarantee that they would be healthy tomorrow. This, of course, did not contribute to improving the health of the population and made life in a medieval city unbearable. Narrow streets and the absence of police contributed to the emergence of street gangs. These groups controlled entire neighborhoods and engaged in robbery and racketeering. They created their own laws and rules, and residents were forced to obey them. Medieval cities were the perfect environment for criminal groups to flourish. The lack of centralized authority, the powerlessness of the guards, and poverty created a vacuum that was filled by gangs. These groups were formed based on territory or occupation. For example, there were gangs of beggars, thieves, and robbers who worked together to protect their interests. They controlled entire neighborhoods and did not allow outsiders to enter their territory. The gangs created their own laws and rules, which were often cruel and unjust. They collected tribute from merchants and craftsmen, and those who refused to pay were punished. It was a kind of racketeering that allowed the gangs to live in luxury, while the rest of the townspeople struggled to make ends meet. The city authorities were powerless to do anything about it, as they did not have enough forces to fight the gangs. In some cases, the authorities preferred not to intervene in order to avoid conflict. Street gangs were also involved in smuggling, dealing in stolen goods, and other illegal activities. They used narrow streets and dark alleys as hiding places where they could escape from the guards. They created their own secret passages and warehouses where they stored stolen goods. These gangs were well organized and had their own hierarchy. At the top were the leaders who made all the important decisions, and at the bottom were the rank and file members who carried out their orders. For the city's residents who lived in areas controlled by gangs, life was a constant nightmare. They could not feel safe day or night. They feared not only robbery, but also kidnapping. Gangs could kidnap a person and demand a ransom, and the authorities could not help in such situations. People were forced to live by the rules of the gangs in order to survive. The emergence of gangs was a direct consequence of social stratification and poverty. People who could not find work and earn an honest living turned to crime. Gangs gave them the opportunity to survive and earn some income. For many, it was the only way to feed themselves. Gangs were not only criminal structures, but also social entities. They gave their members a sense of belonging and protection. People who could not find their place in society could find it in a gang. Thus, gangs were not just criminal groups, but a reflection of the deep social problems that existed in medieval society. All this created an atmosphere of chaos and hopelessness in medieval cities. People lived in constant fear of crime and could not trust anyone. It was a society where everyone was on their own, and there was no room for compassion. In medieval cities, danger lurked at every turn. People feared not only bandits, but also ordinary passers-by. Any argument could end in a fight, and any quarrel could turn into a crime. There were no guarantees of safety, and people tried not to go out after dark. In addition to organized crime, there was a high level of domestic violence in medieval cities. In conditions of poverty, hunger, and constant stress, people were more prone to conflict. Even a minor quarrel could escalate into a fight, and a fight could turn into a knife fight. The lack of effective police and justice meant that people resolved their problems themselves, often by force. This created an atmosphere of constant tension, where every person was a potential threat. The dark hours of the day were especially dangerous. Street lighting was practically non-existent, and the only sources of light were the occasional torches or lanterns lit by wealthy townspeople. Narrow, winding streets turned into mazes of shadows, where it was easy to fall prey to robbers or bandits. Lonely travelers who had to move around the city at night put themselves at great risk. Therefore, people tried to finish all their business before nightfall and not leave their homes unless absolutely necessary. Another source of danger was natural disasters such as fires. Houses built of wood stood so close together that fires spread instantly from one building to another, reducing entire neighborhoods to ashes. The lack of fire departments and water supply made fighting fires almost impossible. Fires claimed the lives of hundreds of people and left thousands homeless. This was a constant threat to all townspeople, regardless of their social status. There was also a danger from vagrants and beggars. Many of them were desperate people who were willing to do anything to survive. They would attack passers-by to steal their money or food. The authorities tried to combat this problem, but their efforts were insufficient. They arrested vagrants and beggars, but this did not solve the underlying problem, the poverty that drove them to crime. All this created an atmosphere of constant fear in the medieval city. People lived in conditions where there were no guarantees of safety. They could not trust the authorities or their neighbors. It was a society where everyone was on their own, and there was no room for compassion. The only way to survive was to adapt to these cruel rules and learn to defend oneself. Even during the day, people did not feel safe. Markets and fairs, which were supposed to be centers of trade and communication, often became places of crime. Pickpockets, swindlers, and thieves operated in the crowds and were difficult to catch. People were forced to be constantly on guard so as not to fall victim to deception. Many medieval cities were shrouded in urban legends and myths that were passed down by word of mouth. People told stories about ghosts, witches, and curses. These legends were not just fiction, but a reflection of the deep fears and anxieties that prevailed in society. In conditions of constant danger, poverty, and disease, people sought explanations for the inexplicable and found them in mysticism and superstition. One of the most common themes in medieval legends was stories about ghosts. People believed that the souls of the dead who had not found peace roamed the streets and houses, frightening the living. Often, the souls of those who died a violent death or were buried without proper rites became ghosts. These stories were a reflection of the constant threat of death that hung over every citizen. People were afraid not only of dying, but also of becoming a ghost that would suffer forever. Another popular theme was legends about witches and sorcerers. People believed that there were people who could communicate with the devil and use dark magic to harm others. Witches were blamed for crop failures, diseases, and other misfortunes. This belief led to mass persecution and executions. Any woman who was different from others could be accused of witchcraft and burned at the stake. These legends were a reflection of the fear of the inexplicable and the desire to find someone to blame for one's misfortunes. Urban legends were also linked to the architecture and history of the city. People told stories about secret passages and underground tunnels that were built to escape enemies. They believed that treasures were hidden in these tunnels, and many tried to find them. These legends reflected the hope for a better life and the belief in a miraculous rescue. In addition, there were legends about curses. People believed that certain places or families were cursed and that misfortune would follow them. These legends reflected the fatalism and hopelessness that prevailed in society. People believed that their fate was predetermined and that they could not change anything. Urban legends were not just entertainment, but an important part of culture. They were passed down from generation to generation and shaped people's worldview. These stories helped them cope with their fears and anxieties, explain the inexplicable, and find meaning in their lives. They were a kind of social psychology that helped people survive in harsh conditions. All this created an atmosphere of mystery and mysticism in medieval cities. People believed in the supernatural and feared it. It was a society where myths and reality were intertwined, and where there was no clear boundary between them. We have examined the dark side of medieval cities and seen that life in them was far from ideal. Poverty, disease, and crime made medieval cities a place where survival was a real challenge. These grim realities were hidden behind the facades of cathedrals and fairs, while unsanitary conditions, social stratification, and the absence of justice turned city streets into veritable jungles. This world was full of contrasts where wealth coexisted with extreme poverty, and faith in God was accompanied by fear of urban legends and superstitions. People lived in constant tension, and were forced to rely only on themselves. Their ability to adapt to harsh conditions and survive in this chaos is admirable. What do you think was the most difficult problem for survival in a medieval city? Write your thoughts in the comments. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. See you next time.